She left home believing she would only do a simple routine exam, trying to understand a strange tiredness that wouldn't go away. But she had no idea that that day would change her life forever. In a building where rich and poor never cross paths, a silent mistake happens behind the scenes and connects two completely opposite worlds in an irreversible way. Days later, an urgent call reveals an impossible truth. She is pregnant by a millionaire she has never seen in her life. And now she must deal with consequences she never chose. Between fear, outrage, and difficult decisions, an unexpected proposal arises, and it could transform an accident into something much greater than any of them imagined. Before discovering how this surprising story unfolds, subscribe to the channel now and prepare yourself for a plot full of twists, emotion, and a love that is born from the impossible. The elevator at Clinica Luminar had a mirror that made everything larger. Camilla Souza noticed this as she went up to the third floor, clutching her synthetic leather bag against her chest, as if the object could protect her from something she still couldn't name. Her face was pale. The dark circles under her eyes were deep. For the last 42 days, she had woken up with the feeling that the world weighed more than it should, and no amount of coffee solved it. Dizziness in the morning, tiredness in the afternoon, a diffuse malaise that had no scheduled time to appear, and even less to leave. The clinic was located in Itaim Bibi, on a street parallel to Faria Lima, and it was the kind of place that served executives with premium plans and also ordinary patients referred by basic insurance. Camilla belonged to the second category. She worked as an administrative assistant at a food distributor in Brass, earned enough to pay the rent for a studio in MoMA, and save a minimal amount every month. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a life of her own, built with effort and without asking favors of anyone. She had scheduled the appointment 2 weeks ago, after a co-worker, seeing her leaning on the edge of the desk for the third time in the same day, said in a low voice, "Go to the doctor, Camilla. Stop fooling yourself." And she went. Not out of fear, but because she was rational enough to understand that ignoring her own body was a form of arrogance she couldn't afford. The doctor who saw her was young, efficient, with that hurried manner of someone with a full room. She ordered routine exams, complete blood count, blood sugar, thyroid function, and a few more that Camilla didn't even bother to memorize. She also requested a routine gynecological procedure, simple without much preparation. Camilla signed the forms, was led to a secondary room by a nursing technician, and there she waited sitting in a blue plastic chair while the hallway outside buzzed with voices, a medication cart and the muffled sound of a cell phone ringing. What happened in the next 20 minutes, Camilla wouldn't know in detail for a long time. In the back hallway, where clinical materials were organized before procedures, Fernanda, a technician who had been working for 11 consecutive hours without a lunch break, picked up the wrong kit. It wasn't malice, it wasn't gross neglect. It was the kind of mistake that happens when a human being is pushed beyond their limit, and the brain simply fails in a second of distraction. She realized the error only when she went to enter it into the system later, and by then it was too late to undo it, without the procedure having been performed. Camilla didn't feel anything different. The procedure was quick, almost without discomfort. The technician was professional, polite, discreet. Camilla got dressed, said thank you, and went down in the same elevator with the large mirror, this time without paying attention to her own reflection. She thought about getting back to work before her lunch hour ended, about the bus she would have to take, about the meeting she had at 2 o'clock. The following days passed without any warning signs. The tiredness continued, which she attributed to the pace of work. The blood test results came back with small alterations that the doctor said were normal for the level of stress she described. Everything seemed to be within a grey zone, that ambiguous territory, where nothing is very wrong but nothing is very right. It was on the 18th morning after the appointment that the phone rang while she was peeling an orange at the kitchen sink. The number was from the clinic. She answered without haste, expecting some bureaucratic follow-up, an appointment rescheduling, or a pending result. The voice of the woman on the other end was restrained, but it carried something that Camilla noticed even before understanding the words. It was that specific quality of the human voice when a person is choosing each term very carefully, as if they were crossing a verbal minefield. "Miss Camilla Souza?" We need you to return to the clinic as soon as possible. There is an important piece of information that needs to be communicated in person." Camilla dropped half of the peeled orange in the sink. She grabbed her bag. She left. On the way, she tried to list the rational possibilities. A test result with a serious alteration, a registration error, something related to the insurance. But there was a quality in the attendant's voice that eliminated administrative hypotheses. It was too personal, too urgent. When she arrived at the clinic, she was led straight to a smaller room, not the same one as the previous appointment. The doctor who had seen her was there, along with an older woman who introduced herself as the clinical coordinator. There was a glass of water on the table that no one had asked for, but which stood there with the clarity of a warning. Camilla, before the doctor finished formulating the second sentence, felt the floor wobble slightly under her feet. It wasn't vertigo. It was the physical sensation of a before and an after separating in time in a permanent and irreversible way. She was pregnant, and the material used in the procedure had belonged to another patient, from a fertilization process that belonged to another person, from another medical record, from another life. The silence that settled in the room was dense enough to be touched. Camilla looked at the glass of water. She didn't take it. She took a deep breath once, then another. Inside, she felt as if someone had turned the world's axis a few degrees to the side, and now all the balance she had built depended on an adjustment she didn't yet know how to make. The coordinator spoke about institutional responsibility, about support, about the next steps. Camilla heard everything with the attention of someone who is present in body but absent in some other dimension. When the voice stopped, she asked only one thing. "Whose is it?" The coordinator hesitated. Then she said a name. Camilla didn't recognize it immediately, but something in the way that name was pronounced, with a specific restraint, with a care that wasn't just clinical, told her that it belonged to someone significant in a world she had never frequented. She left the clinic at 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun was still high. People passed by on the sidewalk with the haste of those who have a certain destination. Camilla stood still for a moment at the door, looking at the street as if she were seeing for the first time a city she thought she knew by heart. She walked aimlessly for a time she couldn't measure, crossing traffic lights on autopilot, with her body following a logic of survival that bypassed the conscious participation of the mind. She stopped at a small cafe on the corner of an unknown street and ordered a glass of water that remained untouched on the table while she stared at nothing. The name the coordinator had said was Rafael Montero. She researched it on her phone inside the taxi she ordered to leave the clinic because taking the bus at that moment seemed impossible. Rafael Montero, 41 years old, founder and CEO of Grupo Montero, a conglomerate with operations in logistics, agribusiness, and real estate development. There were photos of him at corporate events, in business interviews, alongside heavyweight public figures. A man with an angular face and a controlled expression, the type who appears on the covers of economy magazines with the title of Visionary or Entrepreneur of the Year. A man she had never crossed paths with in her life. A man whose world was separated from hers by a distance that isn't measured in kilometers. And inside her, invisible and absolutely real, there was something that combined the two. Half her, half him. An equation that no one had asked for, and that now existed with the serene indifference of all biological things that do not consult anyone before happening. When she got home, she sat on the edge of the bed with the lights off and the window cracked open. Then she took her phone out of her pocket, searched for the name Rafael Montero once more, looked at the photo for a few seconds and placed the device screen down on the mattress. She didn't know yet what she was going to do, but she knew she was going to do something, because staying still had never been an option in her vocabulary, and that situation, as absurd as it was, wasn't going to be the first to change that. Rafael Montero heard the news on a Monday morning, while he was still in the private gym of his apartment in Jardim Europa, in a residential complex where each unit had more square meters than many commercial establishments. He had finished his run on the treadmill and was stretching his back muscles when the phone rang with the private number of Adriano, his most trusted legal advisor. Rafael answered and listened in silence. Adriano had the professional habit of presenting difficult information in a sequential and rational way, like someone putting together a dossier out loud before revealing the conclusion. Raphael let him finish without interrupting. When the advisor stopped, there was a pause of a few seconds that wasn't hesitation but processing. Then he said only, "Send me everything you have in writing and come here at 10. He hung up. He stood still in the center of the gym for a time that didn't last more than a minute, but which had the density of something much larger. Then he walked to the panoramic window that looked out over the garden below and stared at the trees without really seeing them. Raphael was not a man given to visible reactions. This had been built over years, first as a survival mechanism in a family business where showing weakness was an invitation to be disregarded, and later as a deliberate posture of someone who learned that composure at the wrong moment can be the difference between a successful negotiation and a disaster. But there was something in that news that produced inside him not exactly a shock but a rearrangement, as if something that had been out of place for a long time had suddenly found the right position in a completely unexpected way. The material that had been sent to the clinic belonged to the fertilization process he had started alone, 2 years earlier. There was no partner. There was only a decision made in silence after a night when he looked at his own apartment and realized he had spent 10 years building something that was immense on the outside and completely empty on the inside. The company grew, operations multiplied, his wealth was an abstraction with many zeros, and he came home every night to a space that answered to his name but didn't know him. He had kept the process as a plan for the future, something to be resumed when the moment was right, when life was organized enough, when he knew exactly how that would work. And while he waited for the right moment, the material had remained stored at the clinic, and then what happened, happened. Adriano arrived at 10 o'clock sharp with a thin folder and the expression of someone expecting to find a storm. Raphael received him in the library, with coffee, without a storm. "I want to know everything about her. Who she is, where she works, what situation she is in. Not as an investigation, Adriano. As context. I need to know her before any conversation." The advisor took notes. Then he looked at his boss with a caution that was part respect, part genuine concern. "And you, sir, how are you?" Raphael considered the question for a moment. "I was thinking," he said. He left the sentence like that, without completing it, and the advisor was smart enough not to ask for an explanation. The dossier arrived the next day. Camilla Souza, 28 years old, administrative assistant living in MoMA. Undergraduate student in business management at a private college where she was in her 3rd semester with above-average performance. No debts registered in her own name. No legal pending issues. A profile photo on a social network she clearly used little, with the image of a lake in the interior of São Paulo that must have been from some old trip. A serious face. Eyes that looked straight at the camera with a frankness that wasn't arrogance, but was definitely confidence. Raphael looked at the photo for longer than necessary to process information. Then he called the clinic and asked them to intermediate the first contact. He didn't want her to know he had commissioned research on her before introducing himself. That wouldn't be a good way to start. The meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon, in a meeting room at the clinic itself that had been made available for that specific purpose. Raphael arrived early, which was not his usual habit, but which on that day seemed correct. He was sitting when she entered, and here was the first thing that surprised him. She didn't stop at the entrance to evaluate the room or to locate him. She entered with a firm step, looked directly at him, and went to the chair on the other side of the table, like someone entering a territory that isn't theirs, but that they won't treat as if it were. "Good afternoon," she said, without a smile, without hostility, just factual, like someone greeting a stranger who is, due to circumstances beyond the will of both, relevant. "Good afternoon," he replied, with the same temperature. There was a representative from the clinic present who tried to make an introduction. Raphael cut him off gently, but he cut him off. "I prefer that we talk directly." The representative left. The two remained, the table between them, and a silence of a few seconds that was strange but not unbearable. "I know this wasn't your choice," Raphael said. "It wasn't mine either, in any sense that matters here. But it is happening, and I want to understand what you need and what you think about it." Camilla was quiet for a moment. Then she said with a precision he didn't expect, "I need time to think. And I need you to understand that my decision on what to do does not depend on who you are or what you have." He didn't say anything for an instant. Then he nodded his head once, slowly. "I understand that," he said, "and I respect it." The rest of the conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. She didn't ask about money. She didn't ask about the clinic's legal process. She only asked if he had genuinely thought about fatherhood before all this, and the question was asked with a directness that made him stop for a second before answering. "Yes," he said, "I had been thinking about it for longer than you imagine." She looked at him with a different attention after that sentence. It wasn't a softening, it was a reassessment. And when she stood up to leave, Raphael knew, with a certainty that had no logic but was firm, that that conversation had not ended. It had only begun. That night, Raphael stayed later than usual at his office on the 14th floor of a corporate building on Faria Lima, where the city spread out below with that specific luminosity of São Paulo at night, dense and continuous, as if the metropolis never needed darkness to breathe. He had his elbows resting on the desk and his fingers interlaced, in a gesture that the assistant who worked with him had learned to recognize as a sign that something was being processed in depth. Not that there was a problem, but that a decision was being carefully architected. He had spent his life building things, companies, strategies, structures that supported hundreds of jobs and moved a volume of resources that impressed anyone seeing the numbers for the first time. He had built all of this with a determination that people around him sometimes called coldness, but which he knew was something else. It was focus. It was the ability not to disperse energy in directions that led nowhere. And now there was this situation. That woman with the direct gaze who had entered a room and said bluntly that her decision didn't depend on what he had. Raphael had heard a lot over the years. Calculated praise, requests wrapped in consideration, interests disguised as care. What he didn't hear often was someone who simply didn't need anything from him immediately, who was there not to bargain, but to position themselves clearly before an absurd situation. There was something in that which he recognized, not as weakness, as strength. He opened the document that Adriano had prepared with the legal options and recommendations for handling the situation. He read everything carefully. Then he closed the document without taking any of the suggested measures and stared out the window until the city lights began to look like a pattern rather than isolated dots. Camilla took 5 days to make a decision, and those 5 days were the loudest she had lived internally since she could remember. There was no doubt about what she wanted regarding the pregnancy. There was doubt about everything around it, what to accept, what to refuse, where the limit would be between protecting herself and acting sensibly, given what the situation required. The proposal Raphael had sent in writing through Adriano was clear and without excess. He would take full responsibility for medical costs. He offered monitoring, support, and if she wanted, the possibility of living in a property he had available during the pregnancy period. There was no implicit pressure or condition disguised as generosity. There was an offer placed on the table with the precision of someone who doesn't want to be misinterpreted. Camilla read the document 3 times. Then she called her mother in Santo André not to ask for an opinion, but because there was a point where the need to hear a familiar voice outweighed the pride of solving everything alone. Her mother listened with the restraint that characterized her, that woman who had raised Camilla alone, after her father left when Camilla was 7, who had worked 2 jobs at the same time without ever using it as an argument in any discussion. When Camilla finished telling her, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then her mother said, "You already know what you're going to do. You just need someone to confirm it." Camilla was silent. Then she said, "Yes." She accepted the proposal with 3 conditions that she wrote herself in simple language and sent back through the lawyer the clinic had made available to advise her. The first, she would keep her job as long as health conditions allowed. The second, she would have total freedom to come and go without the need for justification. The third, no decision about the child's future would be made without her explicit consent, regardless of any other consideration. Raphael accepted the 3 conditions without any counter-proposal. This surprised her more than she expected. The move happened on a Wednesday morning, with a van Camilla had requested instead of a moving truck, because there wasn't much to move. The bed from the studio wasn't coming along. Neither was the dining table she had bought second-hand and sanded herself. It was just clothes, books, the computer, the pressure cooker her mother had given as a gift, and a few small things that had more sentimental than material value. The apartment in the complex where Raphael lived was in Jardim Europa, but the property he had made available to her was different, a house in Higienopolis, in a gated community of only 4 residences, which had belonged to a former partner and was vacant. It was too big for one person, with 3 bedrooms and an internal garden that caught the morning sun, the kind of space Camilla had never inhabited, and which on the first day seemed more like an architecture exhibit than a place to live. She walked through the rooms with the specific feeling of someone in a strange territory, but refusing to show discomfort. She put her books on one of the living room shelves with her usual naturalness. She set up the computer on the desk in the office at the back, where the window looked out over the garden. She made coffee in the huge kitchen using her own pot, and stood drinking it, looking at the space around her, with her expression of calm evaluation. Raphael appeared in the late afternoon, without prior notice but also without intrusion. He had sent a message asking if she was available, and she had replied yes. He arrived with a bag from a high-quality market in the neighborhood, placed it on the kitchen counter without ceremony, and looked around with the posture of someone checking if there was anything that needed to be resolved. "Do you have what you need?" he asked. "I do," she said, "but it's a lot of space for one person." "It's temporary," he said. "You can rearrange it however you want. What's here has no sentimental value to anyone." She looked at him with that specific attention he had noticed at the clinic meeting. Then she said, "Do you do this often? Answer questions that weren't asked?" He stood still for a second. Then, to his own surprise, he gave a discreet smile. "Sometimes." It was the first thing he said that wasn't strictly functional. It was also the first moment Camilla noticed there was a real human being behind that constructed executive posture, someone who had humor, even if of the dry and economical type. They talked for 40 minutes in that huge kitchen, sitting on opposite sides of the counter. He asked about college, and she spoke without false modesty about her grades and what she wanted to do when she graduated. She asked about agribusiness, and he explained with a clarity that suggested the subject genuinely interested him, not just as a business. When he left, Camilla stayed in the kitchen for a while, with her hands resting on the counter. There was something in that conversation she needed to classify internally before it took a mistaken form. It wasn't attraction. It was something more basic: recognition. The perception that there was a person there who was different from what the magazine cover photograph suggested. This was dangerous in a different way than she had expected. In the following days, she established a routine that was deliberately hers. She woke up early, made coffee, read for an hour before opening the computer. She worked remotely 3 days a week, a concession the manager had accepted, after she explained the situation directly and without unnecessary details. On the other days, she went to the office in bras on the subway because she had made the conscious decision not to use the car Raphael had placed at her disposal for daily commutes. It wasn't stubbornness. It was the maintenance of a habit she understood as part of who she was. The obstetrician who began to follow her was calm and competent, with an office in Jardins that Camilla would never have frequented on her own. In the first appointments, there was a certain rigidity in Camilla faced with a discreet luxury environment she wasn't used to. But the care was real, the attention was real, and she quickly learned to separate the comfort of the context from what actually mattered: her health and the health of the baby growing with silent indifference to all the complexity surrounding its existence. Raphael appeared at the house on Wednesdays. It was the day they had tacitly established for a conversation without a defined agenda, the kind of meeting that starts out looking like protocol and over time gains a different texture. He brought something from the market every now and then, but without excess, like someone who learned that too much attention can be as invasive as neglect. They talked about various topics, and Camilla discovered, without haste, that Rafael Montero had opinions on literature, that he had read more history than most people would suspect, and that he knew how to listen in a way that was rare in any social context. One afternoon, while he was looking at the bookshelf she had organized, he pointed to a book and said, "This one is good." And then he stayed quiet, without further comment. She looked at him. "Why didn't you finish the thought?" "Because I was going to say something about the ending, and you clearly haven't read it yet." She looked at the book, then at him. There was something in that gesture, in that specific restraint of not spoiling someone else's experience, that reached a place she hadn't anticipated. She didn't say anything, but she took the book off the shelf and put it on the nightstand later that night before going to sleep. The 4th month arrived with a change Camilla hadn't anticipated. She started to like the house, not in a dramatic way, not with the kind of surrender that implied yielding. It was a discreet and practical liking, like someone recognizing that an unknown instrument has real qualities. The internal garden received sun from 7 to 10 in the morning, and she had begun to sit there with her coffee before opening her computer. The silence of that 4-house complex was different from the silence of the studio in MoMA, which was actually a silence compressed between the noise from above and the noise from below. Here there was space for the silence to expand. She had also begun to change in other more subtle ways. At the distributor where she worked, the manager had noticed that Camilla had started asking different questions during meetings, not the usual operational questions, but questions about strategy, about cost structure, about why certain decisions were made in a certain way. The manager, a 52-year-old woman with 30 years in the sector, had called Camilla for a private conversation and said, "You were always good at the operational side, but lately it seems like you're thinking differently. What changed?" Camilla had thought about the question for a moment. Then she said, "I started having more time to read and to ask myself things I didn't ask before." The manager had nodded with the expression of someone who understands exactly what that means, because she had gone through the same thing at some point in her own trajectory. What had changed, in fact, was a combination of things. There were the Wednesday conversations, which, without Camilla having planned it, were becoming a space where she tested ideas and received answers that weren't automatic validation, but real thought. Raphael disagreed when he disagreed, and he did it with a precision that was irritating at first and stimulating later. There were also the books she had started reading more carefully, some recommended by him, others she had found on the house's shelves on her own, and there was a kind of clarity that pregnancy brought, paradoxically, about what she wanted for her own life, a clarity that came not from fear, but from a responsibility she had chosen, even if the circumstances were not chosen. It was on a Wednesday of the 5th month that Raphael arrived with something different on his face. It wasn't worry, but there was a specific tension in his shoulders, the kind he didn't usually bring to those conversations. She noticed it immediately. "Something happened," she said, without making it a question. He sat on the garden bench next to her, looked at the plants for a moment, and then said, "My parents arrived Friday, from Ribeirão Preto." Camilla waited for him to continue. "They don't know anything. I kept postponing it because my mother has a specific way of dealing with information that doesn't fit the worldview she built, and I needed time to prepare the ground. But they moved the trip forward without warning. And the ground isn't prepared," Camilla said. "The ground is completely unprepared." She was quiet for a moment. There was something almost funny in that, if funny were the right word. A man who moved operations that employed thousands of people was sitting on a garden bench with the expression of someone who doesn't know how to explain a situation to his own mother. It was human in a way she hadn't expected. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. He looked at her. "Nothing you don't want to, but they're going to want to see me, and if they see me, they're going to want to see the house, and if they see the house, they're going to understand that someone is living here, and then it will need an explanation." "And what explanation do you want to give?" "The truth," he said without hesitating. "I just want to know if you are willing to be present when I give it." She stared at the garden for a while. Then she said, "It depends on how your mother looks at people who are not from the same world as you." He took a second to respond. "With superiority most of the time. Most of the—" "Then prepare me," Camilla said. because I don't have any problem with superiority. I know how to deal with it better than most people imagine. Raphael looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read. It wasn't performative admiration. It was the kind of recognition that comes from realizing, at a specific moment, that the person in front of you has a quality you genuinely respect. The dinner was set for the following Saturday. Camilla didn't lose an hour of sleep thinking about it. She chose an outfit that was hers, that didn't try to imitate any environment other than her own, and presented herself with the same posture with which she entered any room, direct, present, without apologizing for existing. Dalva Montero was 68 years old, had well-kept white hair, a pearl necklace that was probably a family heirloom, and a way of looking that evaluated before committing to any expression. When she saw Camilla, there was a pause of exactly 2 seconds that contained volumes. Camilla greeted her by name without diminutives, with a firm handshake, and then, before Dalva could formulate the first question with subtext, Camilla said, "I know this is unusual for everyone. For me, too. But Raphael was honest with me from the beginning, and I think you deserve the same thing." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be significant. And then Geraldo Montero, Raphael's father, who had been standing next to his wife with a careful waiting expression, let out a short laugh and said, "I like this girl." Dalva didn't smile, but the pearl necklace moved slightly, as if she had released some of the air she was holding. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Camilla didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't. When Dalva asked about the family, she answered with precision and without ornament, mother in Santo Andre, father absent from an early age, herself in college for 2 years after having postponed it for financial reasons. When the subject reached work, she described what she did without apology and without exaggeration. Dalva asked questions that had subtext, the kind that test limits before revealing themselves as judgment. Camilla answered them all with the same temperature of someone who isn't being tested because she doesn't accept the exam. It was a posture that wasn't rude but was absolutely clear. I know who I am, and I don't need you to define me. At some point after dessert, while Geraldo and Raphael were talking about a property in the interior, Dalva looked at Camilla with an expression different from the previous ones. It wasn't approval yet, but it was something that had the shape of the beginning of a cautious respect. "You aren't afraid of anything," Dalva said. It wasn't an immediate compliment. It was an observation. "I am," Camilla said. "I just don't let fear decide for me." Dalva looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned her head toward her son, who was talking to his father without realizing he was being observed, and then back to Camilla, with an expression that had layers that would take time to decipher. That night, when Raphael's parents left and the house grew quiet, Camilla sat in the dark garden for a while before going inside. She was tired, but it was a different kind of tiredness than usual. It was the kind that comes after being whole in a situation that demanded a lot, and having come out of it still being the same person who had entered. Raphael appeared at the garden door a few minutes later. He stood in the doorframe without entering and said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I did it because it's the way I am." She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary for the context. Then she turned her face to the dark garden and said, "Good night, Raphael." He said good night and left. And Camilla sat there for a while longer, with one hand lightly resting on her growing belly, thinking about something she hadn't said out loud yet, that there was something there that was becoming increasingly difficult to call just a circumstance. The 6th month brought with it the São Paulo winter, the kind that isn't rigorous but has the persistent humidity of a city that breathes concrete, and it also brought a change in the pace of the Wednesdays. The conversations that previously had a predictable duration of 1 hour, sometimes an hour and a half, began to extend. There was more to say, or rather, there was less hurry to say less. Camilla noticed this without naming it. It was safer not to name some things. On one of those longer nights, she had shown Raphael the project she was developing for college, an analysis of the distribution chain of perishable foods in São Paulo, with a focus on logistical efficiency in supplying small markets. It was a work she had started as an academic exercise, but which had grown into something denser, with real data she had collected over the years of working at the distributor. Raphael read it carefully and without rushing. Then he asked questions that were not those of a teacher, but of a professional. The kind of question that implies the person is thinking of the data as real tools, not as components of a school evaluation. "This data here is underutilized," he said, pointing to a graph. "You have the information, but you're not using it to argue what you could argue. I showed it to the professor, and she said it was complete. For her objectives, it is. For what the work could be, it isn't." Camilla looked at him. "So it's not a college assignment. It's real research." "It's exactly what it seems to be," he said, with the simplicity of someone who isn't trying to impress. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook and started taking notes. They stayed working on that for another 2 hours, side by side at the living room table, with the laptop open and papers with notes scattered around. It was the kind of collaboration that arises naturally when two people have compatible working rhythms. And Camilla noticed that with the rational side of her mind, while the less rational side remained carefully silent. When they finished, her back was aching in the way that had been happening more frequently in recent weeks. That low pressure, the doctor had said, was normal, but was persistent enough to be bothersome. She moved with a small effort she tried not to show. Raphael noticed. He didn't sound an alarm, didn't ask with that exaggerated anxiety she had feared in the first months. He just said with his usual calm, "You need a different chair to work in. Your spine needs better lumbar support." She was going to say she was fine. But she stopped because there was something in that observation that wasn't intrusion. It was attention. The kind that comes from having paid attention to the person over weeks. "All right," she said. "Yes, the chair is not good." The next morning there was a new chair in the back office, ergonomic in the correct position, with a small note that said only, "Lumbar support adjustable via the button on the side." She stared at the note for a while. Then she folded the paper and put it in her pocket without throwing it away. There were other small things she started noticing over those weeks. The way he never arrived without warning, but also never left too long a gap without some contact. The way he had learned, without asking explicitly, that she preferred juice to soda and that she didn't like cilantro. The way he listened when she spoke about work with the same interest with which she listened when he spoke about the group's operations, an interest that wasn't courtesy, but had the texture of genuine curiosity. It was in these small things that Camilla began to lose herself, not in a dramatic way, but with the specific slowness of someone who realizes the ground under their feet has been gradually changing while they were paying attention to something else. Dalva had returned to São Paulo alone on a July morning, without prior notice to Camilla, but with a message that arrived through Raphael's phone, and that he passed on with an expression that was impossible to classify. "My mother wants to have lunch with you. Just with you." Camilla had stared at the message on Raphael's phone for a second. Then she said, "Where?" "At a restaurant in Pinheiros that Dalva had frequented for decades, and that had the kind of menu that didn't need any effort to be read because things were simply there, without elaborate descriptions." Dalva arrived early, was sitting with her back straight and her usual necklace, and when Camilla arrived, she stood up to greet her with a gesture that wasn't warm, but was unequivocally respectful. They talked about many things over 2 hours. About the pregnancy, about the future, about São Paulo and about Ribeirão Preto, about Camilla's mother, and about how it is to build a life alone when no one gave a shortcut. Dalva was not an easy woman, but she was a woman who knew how to recognize substance when she saw it, and that Camilla had understood since the Saturday dinner. At the end of lunch, when the coffee was on the table and the conversation had reached a slower pace, Dalva said without preparation, "You know he is different since you arrived." Camilla waited for her to continue. "I'm not saying it's because of you," Dalva said, with the precision of someone who wants to be understood correctly. "I'm saying he is different since this whole situation started. More present, more human perhaps. He was always good. But there was something missing for a long time, and I never knew exactly what." Camilla looked at the coffee cup. Then she looked at Dalva. "I don't know exactly what either," she said with honesty. Dalva looked at her with that layered gaze. Then she said, "But you will find out. That's the kind of thing people like you find out. On the way back to Higienopolis, Camilla stared out the subway window at the dark tunnel passing between stations. There was something growing inside her that no longer fit into the category of circumstance, and for the first time she allowed that thought to stay in the center of her consciousness for a few seconds before gently pushing it to the periphery from where she knew it wouldn't take long to return. That same week, Raphael appeared on a Wednesday with an expression slightly different from the usual. It wasn't tension, it was something more like hesitation, which was unusual enough for Camilla to notice immediately. They were in the garden with the cold of the July night arriving slowly when he said, after a silence that had lasted a bit longer than usual, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him. "How do you imagine the future of this? Not the baby, the rest." It was a huge question dressed in a small way. Camilla recognized this. She was quiet for long enough to really think before answering. "I don't know," she said. "And when I say I don't know, it's not an evasion. It's honesty about something that hasn't yet finished taking shape." He nodded. Then he said, "I don't know either. But I realize I've been thinking about it with a frequency that isn't just processing circumstance." She stared at the dark garden. Then she said slowly, "Give me more time." "I have all the time," he said. And there was something in that sentence, in the simple and direct way it was said, that reached a place Camilla had trained for years to keep well protected. She didn't say anything else that night. But when he left and she entered the house and sat on the bed with her hand over her belly, that now moved with those light and unmistakable presences, she thought that there were some things for which time was not an infinite resource, and that perhaps he knew that very well. The 7th month arrived with a revelation that came from a completely unexpected place, and which changed the angle of everything that had been built until then with a precision that seemed, in retrospect, inevitable. It started in a banal way. Camilla's mother had come to spend a weekend in Higienopolis, the first visit since the move had happened. She arrived with a small suitcase and the discreet posture of someone who observes without commenting, walked through the rooms of the house with open eyes and closed lips, ran her hand over the bookshelves with an attention that was almost affection. At night, after the dinner they made together with the familiarity of two people who cooked side by side for years, they sat in the garden with hot tea, and her mother said, after a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, "This house does you good." Camilla nodded without comment. "It's not the house," her mother said after a moment. "It's what you are doing inside it." Camilla looked at her. "You are growing, Camilla. And it's not because of the belly. It's something else." They were silent for a while. Then her mother asked, bluntly, as was her custom, "And him? What is he really like?" Camilla thought about the answer for longer than she expected. Then she said, "He's the kind of person who notices when you need lumbar support in a chair without you having to ask. And he doesn't do it as a gesture. He does it because he paid attention." Her mother looked at her with that expression mothers have when they know much more than the daughter admits. She said nothing. She just picked up her teacup and took a sip. The weekend ended. Her mother went back to Santo André on Monday morning, and Camilla stared at the garden after the taxi disappeared around the corner, feeling the specific quality of a space that had received a loved one and was now returning to its habitual rhythm. It was that afternoon that Adriano called Raphael, and Raphael called Camilla with a voice that had something different inside it. Not urgency, but weight. "I need to stop by there earlier today, Thursday, if you can." She said she could. He arrived at 5 in the afternoon with a folder he didn't usually bring for Wednesday visits. He sat at the kitchen table with the folder closed on the top for a moment before opening it, as if he were internally organizing what he was going to say. "There is information that arrived about the legal process with the clinic," he said, "information that was not communicated to you adequately when all this started, and that I just discovered as well, because the legal process went deeper than expected." Camilla looked at him without saying anything. "The material that was used in the clinic procedure," he said, "was material that I had originally deposited for a fertilization process. But that process had a specification that I had not explicitly communicated to the clinic when I entered the treatment 2 years ago." a specification that the clinic should have verified before any procedure involving that material. "What kind of specification?" Camilla asked. Raphael opened the folder. There was a 2-page document that he gently slid across the table toward her. "When I deposited the material, there was a documented medical requirement that established that any future use should be accompanied by a complete genetic screening process for compatibility, a condition that the clinic completely neglected when Fernanda picked up the wrong kit. The error wasn't just a material swap. It was failing to verify the specific protocols associated with that material." Camilla looked at the document. There was technical language she slowly deciphered. "What does this mean?" she said, not because she didn't understand, but because she wanted him to say it out loud. "It means the clinic failed on 2 levels, not 1. And it means the baby is genetically healthy. The screening that was done later confirmed that the obstetrician has all the data. But it also means there is an ongoing legal process of institutional responsibility that goes beyond what was initially communicated to you, and you need to have full access to this information." She stared at the document for a long time. There was something reorganizing internally, not in a painful way, but with the clarity of someone who realizes a piece that was out of place has found where it fits. "Did you know this before?" she said, looking at him. "No. Adriano discovered it when he went deeper into the process. And the first thing I thought when I found out was that you needed to know too." She studied his face for a moment with that attention that was one of her things, this ability to read what was underneath what was said. There was honesty there without ornament. There was no calculation about what would be strategic to reveal and what was more convenient to keep obscure. And that somehow was heavier than any declaration would have been. "Why are you telling me this in person instead of sending it through the lawyer?" she said. "Because it's not a legal matter. It's your matter, and you deserve to hear it from me." The silence that followed had a different quality from all the other silences that had existed between them. It had the texture of something that was becoming, of a state that was transforming into another, slowly but in a way that could no longer be undone. Camilla stared at the document still on the table. Then she closed it with both hands, slowly. "Thank you," she said, "for coming yourself." "You're welcome," he said. And there was something in that simple word, said with a voice slightly less controlled than usual, that she kept inside herself with the care of someone who knows that certain things do not repeat. In the days following the Thursday meeting, Camilla noticed a change in the way she thought about what was between them. It was no longer an active denial, that effort to classify everything as circumstance and agreement and a practical situation. It was something closer to acceptance, not in a way that made her vulnerable, but in a way that made her honest with herself. She was in some way that didn't fit into just one word, liking him. Not the executive from the magazine covers, not the man who had paid for the house and the doctor and the ergonomic chair. The Raphael who disagreed with precision and listened with attention, who had learned that she preferred juice to soda without making a gesture of it, who had gone personally to tell her something difficult because he understood she deserved to hear it from a person, not from a document. It was this Raphael she had allowed, without planning, to enter a zone she had kept strictly protected. The following Wednesday, when he arrived with the cold August wind on his shoulders and sat on the garden bench beside her, Camilla didn't wait for the conversation to develop organically, as always. She said, before any other subject began, "I know the answer to the question you asked me weeks ago." He looked at her. "About how I imagine the future of this. I know now." "And how do you imagine it?" he said, with a voice that was clearly trying to maintain the same tone as always and wasn't entirely succeeding. "I don't know the details," she said. "I don't have a plan, but I no longer imagine it without you as a part." And that's something I needed to say out loud because keeping it inside was becoming very heavy. Raphael looked at her for a time that wasn't long, but had density. Then he said slowly, "I was waiting for you to get there on your own, because I knew that if I said it first, you would need much more time to trust. You know me better than I thought," she said. "I've been paying attention," he said, carefully. She didn't move closer. He didn't either. But there was something that had crossed from one side to the other that didn't need a physical gesture to be real. It was real with the precision of all the things that were not said before the right moment. The 8th month arrived with news that no one expected, and which came from a place Camilla hadn't anticipated. Beatrice. Beatrice Cavalcante was 35 years old, a medical specialist in human reproduction, and had been for 3 years the only person with whom Raphael had maintained something close to a relationship after a short marriage that ended at 34 without children and without scandal. Just with that slow dissolution that happens when two adults realize they built something that never had a real foundation. Camilla didn't know of Beatrice's existence. There was no reason to know, and Raphael had never mentioned her, not out of calculated omission, but because she belonged to a past he considered closed. But Beatrice had learned of the pregnancy, as things inevitably reach people in small, interconnected circles, and had decided, for reasons Camilla would only understand later, to show up. She appeared on a Sunday morning when Camilla was alone in Higienopolis with Raphael out of São Paulo for a board meeting in Campinas. The doorbell rang, and Camilla opened it without checking the intercom because she was expecting a delivery from a pharmacy order she had made in the morning. It was a woman with dark hair and an elegance that needed no effort to be perceived. She introduced herself by name with a controlled voice and said, "I need to talk to you. I know it's unusual, but I need to." Camilla looked at her for a moment. Then she opened the door a bit more and said, "Come in." They sat in the living room. Beatrice spoke without excessive bluntness, with the precision of someone who had prepared what she was going to say, but was not reciting. She explained who she was. She explained the past relationship with Raphael. She said she had found out about the pregnancy through a colleague who had a connection to Clinica Luminar, and that she had come because there was something she needed to say, not out of self-interest, as she herself hastened to make clear, but because she considered that Camilla deserved to know. The material that had been used in the clinic, Beatrice said, had been deposited during the period when she and Raphael still had some contact. And there was, in that period, a conversation the two had had about the possibility of Raphael someday using that material for a fertilization process. Camilla listened in silence. Raphael never asked me for permission, because there was no legal reason to ask. The material was his, but there was a conversation, and I want you to know that there was never an agreement, there was never a joint plan, there was only a conversation that led nowhere because we led nowhere. Camilla stared at her for a long time. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this?" Beatrice looked at her. "Because you deserve to know the full context of the story you were placed in, and because, since I learned you existed, I've been hearing things about you from people who know you indirectly, and what I heard convinced me that you are the kind of person who prefers knowing to not knowing." There was something in that sentence that rang true in a way that made the whole situation stranger, and also, paradoxically, cleaner. "And Raphael," Camilla said. "Does he know you're here?" "No," Beatrice said, "and he doesn't need to know, unless you want to tell him." "Why are you doing this?" Camilla said, not with hostility, but with a real need to understand. Beatrice was silent for a moment. Then she said, with an honesty that had the weight of something that had been cared for internally for a while, "Because I knew Raphael well enough to know he is a good person who takes time to open up, and because what I hear about you tells me you are the kind of presence he needs, and I would have it on my conscience if I hadn't said it." They were silent for a time. Then Camilla said, with that voice she used when she was processing something important, "Thank you for coming. I know it wasn't easy." Beatrice stood up, shook Camilla's hand firmly, and left without leaving a phone number, without asking for anything. Camilla sat in the living room for a long time after the door closed. There was something fitting together inside her, with a clarity that hurt slightly, not in a bad way, but in the way it hurts when something that was tensed finally finds its position. She called Raphael that afternoon, not to tell him about Beatrice, not yet, to ask simply what time he was arriving. "At 7 tonight," he said. "Why?" "Because I want to talk when you arrive. There is something I need to say." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he said, "I'll be there at 6:30. She almost said it wasn't necessary, but she didn't, because there was something in that discreet and voluntary haste, in that 6:30 instead of 7, that was exactly the kind of thing that had stopped being just a detail and had become, over the months, everything. Raphael arrived at 6:28, with his coat still on his arm, and the expression of someone who spent the afternoon in a long meeting but hadn't let that become the central subject of his arrival. Camilla was in the garden with tea that had gone cold, and he went straight there without going through the kitchen first, which she noticed. He sat on the bench beside her. He didn't ask what had happened, he waited. She told him about Beatrice. She told him everything, in the correct chronological order, and without dramatizing any part. Raphael listened in complete silence until the end. When she finished, he spent some time looking at the garden. Then he said, "Are you angry?" She considered the question truly. "No," she said. "I have much more clarity than before." He looked at her. "Beatrice came because she thought I deserved the full context. And she was right, and the full context doesn't change what I know about you now. It only tells me where you came from before here." Raphael stared at her with an expression she had learned to read over months. It was the expression of when something reached him in a way he hadn't completely armored against. She continued, "You could have told me about her before, but I understand why you didn't. It wasn't a mission. It was that the past didn't seem relevant to the present that was being built." "It was exactly that," he said, with a voice slightly different from usual. Camilla placed the cold teacup on the bench between them and turned her body toward him, with that movement that was becoming progressively slower in recent days, the weight of the 8th month present in every gesture. "I need to ask you something direct," she said. He waited. "What you feel for me has nothing to do with the situation, with the baby, with the clinic, with the responsibility. It's a separate thing from that." It wasn't quite a question. It was Camilla's way of saying something and awaiting confirmation without making it a dependency. Raphael looked at her for a moment, with that total attention that was one of the hardest things to find in a person, and that she had learned, over the months, was a central part of who he was. "It is completely separate," he said, "and it started long before I understood that's what it was." She looked at him. "When?" "When you entered that meeting room at the clinic and went straight to the chair without stopping to position yourself, when you asked whose it was before asking anything else, when you said your decision didn't depend on what I had. There was in the dark garden of Higienopolis a silence that wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people after the most important thing has been said, and what comes next doesn't need to be words." Raphael reached for her hand on the bench slowly, without haste, and she didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a time that had no measurable duration, with the contained noise of the city around them and the small garden being the entire world for a few minutes. There was a story that had begun in a mistake, and it was becoming, with that irreversible slowness of true things, something that neither of them had planned, and that was, for that very reason, entirely theirs. Motherhood didn't arrive like in the movies. There was no drama in the arrival, no cinematic urgency. It arrived as important things arrive in real life, in the early morning, with a calm that was both surprising and absolutely correct. Camilla woke up at 2:48 on a September morning with that different pressure the doctor had described in the appointments, and that she had kept in her memory as a reference for when the time came. She lay there for a few minutes, breathing slowly, evaluating. Then she picked up the phone and sent a message to Raphael. "I think it's starting." He replied in less than 2 minutes. "I'm leaving." She got up, took a shower with a calm that was deliberate, because she had decided months ago that she wasn't going to let her body decide the emotional rhythm of that moment. She placed the bag that had been ready since week 36 next to the door. When Raphael arrived at 3:20, she was sitting in the kitchen with a glass of water, her back straight and her eyes completely awake. He looked at her for a second from the entrance. "Are you okay?" he said, not with alarm, but with that usual attention. "I am," she said. "Let's go." In the car toward the maternity hospital in Jardines, she stared out the side window at São Paulo in the early morning. The city had a different quality at those hours, slower, with those pockets of silence between the headlights and the streets wet from the dew. There was something she wanted to say but kept inside, not for lack of courage, but because she felt the moment needed to be what it was first, without more words about what it was becoming. Raphael didn't talk much on the way, but he kept a hand near hers on the seat, not on top, just near, and she noticed this with the part of her that noticed these things with a precision she had learned no longer to ignore. The birth lasted 4.5 hours. The doctor was there, the team was good, and Camilla did it with the same posture with which she had done everything that really mattered in life, concentrated, present, without abandoning herself for a single second. Raphael stayed outside the room for part of the time, then was called in when the process was advanced, because she had said weeks before that she wanted him to be there, and she had said it with the simplicity of someone who doesn't need much preamble for things that are clear. At 7:13 in the morning, with the September sun entering through the maternity corridors, Francisco was born. It was a name they had chosen together on an August afternoon, in a simple way. She had said she liked names that had weight but not ostentation, and he had said Francisco without hesitating, and she had stayed quiet for a second and then said, yes. Francisco had Camila's eyes, and something in the shape of his shoulders that was Raphael's, though it was too early to be sure of anything beyond the basic miracle of existing. When the nurse placed the baby in Camila's arms for the first time, she stared at him for a time she couldn't measure. There was inside her something that had no adequate word in any language, but which had the shape of a completeness she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the abstract love people describe. It was something more physical, more immediate. The absolute certainty that there was a new person in the world who was, in part, hers, and that this was real in a way that made many other things suddenly smaller. Raphael was standing next to the bed with an expression she had expected to need to decipher. But she didn't. It was clear. It was the expression of someone seeing, for the first time, something they had imagined from afar for a long time, and which was now present in a way that made imagination completely insufficient. "Do you want to hold him?" she said. He nodded. She passed Francisco into his arms with the care of someone transferring something that is both fragile and absolutely firm. Raphael stood still with the baby in his arms for a while. Then he looked at Camilla with an expression that had within it the texture of all the Wednesdays and all the silences and all the things said and unsaid over those months. "Thank you," he said, "for everything you were in this story." "It wasn't for you," she said with a smile that was the first smile of that kind she had given him. "It was because it's the way I am." He smiled. The same discreet smile she had seen for the first time in the kitchen of the house in Higienopolis, months ago, when she had asked if he answered questions that weren't asked. There were things that would need to be resolved. The future of the house, the legal agreements, the way that new life would be organized between two adults who had reached a place neither of them had planned. There were conversations ahead, decisions, adjustments. But in that maternity room with the September sun in the window, and Francisco sleeping with the specific serenity of someone who doesn't yet know the weight of the world, all of that was for later. Now there was only that. And that was enough in a way she hadn't learned until then to recognize the sufficiency of things that are true, without needing to be perfect. Dalva arrived at the hospital at 10 in the morning, with Geraldo by her side and the pearl necklace in its usual place. She entered the room with a restraint that was her way of dealing with emotions that were larger than the vocabulary she had built for them. She stood still at the entrance for a second upon seeing Francisco in Camilla's arms. Then she approached. She stared at the baby for a long moment, with an expression Camilla had never seen in her before. It was the complete softening of a woman who had spent her life building elegant armor and who, faced with that small and serene face, simply stopped needing it. "May I?" Dalva said, and it was the first time Camilla heard that woman ask for something with that quality of voice. "Of course," Camilla said, and she held out the baby. Dalva held Francisco with a skill that said she had done this before, decades ago when her own son was this small. And there was something in this scene that closed a circle that had remained open for a long time, not in a dramatic way, but with the naturalness of things that simply find the place where they belong. Geraldo stood next to his wife with his hand lightly resting on her shoulder, and Raphael stood next to Camilla's bed with that proximity that had become, over the months, the physical form of an understanding the two had built slowly and with care. Camilla's mother arrived later, with her eyes shining from the doorway, and the room became full of those people who had reached that point through completely different paths and who were now there, around that new being who knew nothing of this and slept with the peace of one who simply is. That afternoon, when the visitors left and the room grew quiet, Camilla lay with Francisco in the bassinet beside her, and Raphael sitting in the armchair near the window, reading a work document in silence. It was a banal scene. It was the kind of scene that has no grandeur, that wouldn't be told to anyone as the decisive moment of anything, but there was in it a completeness that Camilla recognized with a certainty that needed no verification. This was home. Not the house in Higienopolis, not the apartment in Jardim Europa. It was this. Two people with their own whole natures in a shared space, without demanding that either of them stop being what they were so the other could exist. Francisco breathed in the bassinet with that perfect cadence of newborns, and Camilla, looking at him with half-open eyes, thought that there are some stories that don't need a perfect beginning. They just need two people who have enough courage to grow in the place where they were placed, without pretending the ground is anything else. 6 months after Francisco's birth, Camilla defended her final graduation project with an analysis that had grown, over that impossible year, from an academic exercise into a research paper that the professor had recommended for publication in a management and logistics journal. In the audience were her mother, Raphael, and Dalva, who had made the trip from Ribeirão Preto specifically for that afternoon, which had surprised Camilla and which Dalva had dismissed with a wave of her hand as if it were obvious. The panel asked questions that Camilla answered with the precision of someone who knows her own work from the inside out. When she finished, there was a silence of evaluation that lasted a few seconds, and then the professor said, "Approved with distinction." Camilla didn't cry. She sat for a moment with that expression of calm evaluation that was her expression, and then she stood up and went to the audience with the step that had always been hers. Her mother hugged her without needing to say anything. Raphael stood beside her with Francisco in his arms, and the baby, with his 6 months of existence and the complete indifference of someone who doesn't yet understand the gravity of formal occasions, grabbed Raphael's identification badge and began to chew on it with admirable determination. Raphael looked at his son with that expression he had learned since September, the expression of someone who was completely opened up by a small presence and has no intention of closing back up. The following month, Camilla accepted an invitation to join as a consultant a Grupo Montero initiative focused on logistical efficiency for small distributors. It wasn't because of Raphael. It was because the proposal was good. The scope was exactly the theme she had researched, and she had reached the point where refusing opportunities for fear of appearing dependent was as mistaken as accepting out of necessity. She accepted because she wanted to, and that, she had learned over that year, was the difference that mattered. The house in Higienopolis remained, not as a temporary concession, but as a choice. They didn't move into the same space all at once, because neither of them was the kind of person who makes life decisions with the haste of circumstances. They arrived gradually, with the respectful slowness of things that are built to last. Dalva never explicitly said she had changed her opinion about Camilla, but she started calling on Tuesdays, for no specific reason, to talk about various things, and Camilla learned that, for that woman, the regularity of contact was the way of saying what she didn't know how to say with words. On a March afternoon the following year, Camilla was in the garden in Higienopolis with Francisco on the ground on a blanket, watching the baby discover with total concentration the texture of a fallen leaf. Raphael arrived from work earlier than usual, threw his coat on a chair, and went to sit beside her on the grass without caring about his suit. They stayed watching Francisco for a while, in silence. Then Raphael said, "You're thinking about something." "Always," she said. "About what, this time?" "About what I would have lost if I had said no to all of this in the beginning." He looked at her. "Not as a regret of the opposite," she said with precision. "As gratitude for the path that happened." Raphael looked at her for a moment with that total attention. Then he said, "I think about that too, with a frequency that would probably be surprising to those who have known me longer than you have. She looked at him. "And it's not surprising to me," she said. "No," he agreed. "To you it never was." Francisco let go of the leaf and looked at the two of them with the satisfied expression of someone who just solved a complex problem. Then he returned to the world of things that had texture, temperature, and immediate interest, completely oblivious to the fact that the story that had begun with a mistake on an autumn afternoon had arrived through a path no one had projected, exactly where it needed to arrive. End of the story. Dear listeners, if the story of Camila and Rafael touched something in you, know that it was written for that, to remind you that imperfect beginnings do not prevent true endings, that love can arise where it is least expected, grow in the silence of a garden, in an ergonomic chair, in a Wednesday conversation that lasts longer than it should. We have stories here that live in the same way, built with care for those who want to truly feel. If you've made it to the end, you already know you have the stomach for what matters. So subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and leave a comment. Would you stay on Camila's side or Rafael's side when all of that began? We want to know. Every story we publish is born from you who watch, comment, and share. Until next time.